My partner always took care of my son from another relationship. Later, we had our own son, but now that we're divorced, he's only giving me money for his biological son. How can he be so cruel? The day they told me I could only see my baby with a supervisor, I felt like my right to breathe had been taken away. Me, who literally gave birth to him, having to ask permission to give him a kiss as if it were a prison visit. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst was that Jorge was there, calm, with that face of a righteous man that everyone applauds, while I was trembling with rage. Kevin didn't even look at me, as if I were an embarrassing problem to be put away in a drawer. I was left with empty hands and a humiliation that still burns, and that's why I need to explain how we got to this point. I met Jorge when Kevin was 4 years old, an age when children are sponges and also silent judges. I was tired of men who promised and disappeared. Because Kevin's biological father was literally a ghost, one of those who leaves a belly and then pretends they never existed. Jorge arrived with a security that seemed like a lifesaver because he talked about the future with an insulting ease, as if life were a calendar that could be organized. He looked at me, looked at my son, and didn't run away. That simple decision for me was pure love. From the beginning, I was clear. I wasn't going to sell myself as a free and easy woman. I came with a combo, and that's not a funny phrase, it's a reality. Kevin was my priority, my reason for getting up, and I needed a man who understood that entering my life meant entering a family. Jorge said yes, that he wanted that he liked children, that responsibilities didn't scare him. I saw him playing with Kevin in the park, crouching down to his level, and everything inside me melted because I thought that finally someone was going to stay. I fell in love with the idea of a man choosing to stay in a world where everyone flees. Jorge got into the role as if he were born for it, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't beautiful. He taught Kevin to ride a bike. That typical scene of running behind a child with knee pads, but for me it was a healing scene because I never had that. Kevin looked at him like you look at superheroes, with admiration, with that absolute trust that's scary to break. I, with a swollen heart, thought that was it, that this was what I deserved after so much chaos. And yes, I liked that people saw us as a family from an advertisement. I'm not going to deny it. The dynamic became a routine, and in routine one gets used to the good as if it were an acquired right. Jorge paid for Kevin's school, and it wasn't just any school. It was private, one of those with expensive uniforms and fees that look at you funny if you have questions. I interpreted it as a real commitment, as an invisible signature that said, I'm the father even if there's no blood. We started living together, and I let him lead many things because he did it with such naturalness that it was almost a relief. I admired him, and at the same time his calmness irritated me, because sometimes it seemed like he didn't feel anything. With time our baby together arrived, and that sealed things even more in my head. I was convinced that now we were a complete family and Jorge had no way out. He acted like that too. He talked about the future, about savings, about stability, about those words that sound nice until you realize they are also chains. Kevin was excited to be a big brother, and I felt powerful as if my life finally had a correct narrative. I like to think that I had fixed my story, that I had turned abandonment into a structure. But what nobody says is that stability also demands that one stay still. And I wasn't born to stay still. I have big, strong, intense emotions, and yes, sometimes they came out of my body as crises, because when you've lived alone carrying everything, your body gets tired and explodes. Jorge started looking at me as if I were a problem to be managed, like a project that wasn't turning out perfectly. I noticed he tensed up when I cried. That he took a deep breath as if he were counting to 10 to not scream. That hurt me because I wasn't acting, I was feeling. He said he was overwhelmed by my emotional crises, with invisible quotation marks, as if they were a whim. I tried to explain that a mother doesn't turn off like a switch, that the fear of losing everything isn't cured with logic. But Jorge responded like men who believe emotion is manipulation. Cold, calculated arguments began, like meetings, and I felt my house was becoming a courtroom. And when you feel judged in your own home, love becomes war. The separation came as things with Jorge always do, orderly, inevitable, already decided before I could negotiate. One day he told me that this wasn't working anymore, that he needed peace, that I drained him, that I should think about the children. That phrase is the cruelest because they use it as a moral shield while they're breaking your chest. I asked him what would happen with Kevin, because Kevin had had him as a father his whole conscious life. Jorge looked at me with a serenity that still makes me angry and said that he would take care of what was his responsibility, and then I understood that for him, what was his responsibility had blood. When we divorced, he started paying the legal child support for our baby together, punctually, cleanly, like a soulless deposit. I'm not saying he didn't do it, he did, but he did it like someone paying a fine. And with Kevin, he cut everything off as if he had turned off a switch. I looked at him, and it seemed inhuman to me. Because it's not just money, it's the message, it's telling a child that affection has conditions. Kevin started asking about Jorge with a mixture of sadness and confusion, and I bit my tongue so as not to explode in front of him. The real problem was that Jorge had accustomed Kevin to a standard of living that I couldn't sustain on my own. It's not that I wanted luxuries out of vanity, it's that Kevin was already there in that school with those friends, with that routine. And tearing him away from that was like tearing away a part of his identity. I began to feel the ground opening up every time I saw the bills. Because the world doesn't forgive you for not having a provider husband. Jorge knew that, of course he knew. And yet he decided Kevin was not his problem. For me, that was a major betrayal, one of those that can't be justified by any law. I called him and told him the obvious, that if he had chosen to be a father figure, he couldn't now pretend to be a stranger. I reminded him of everything: the school, the bike, the promises, the times Kevin called him dad. Jorge defended himself with correct phrases, saying he wasn't the legal father, that he had obligations to the baby, that he couldn't carry everything. I listened to that and felt like he was telling me my son was an accessory that no longer suited him. My face burned with helplessness. Then I said, the only thing I thought could touch his conscience, because Jorge lives off his image as a good man. I told him that if he didn't help with both, I would get so depressed that I couldn't take care of either, that I wanted to see if his conscience would let him sleep. It wasn't an empty threat, it was my reality, because when you're alone with 2 children and the world on your shoulders, your body takes its toll. I needed him to feel a little of the weight I felt. But Jorge didn't react as I expected, he didn't soften, he didn't break, he didn't tell me, don't worry, we'll fix it. What he did was maintain that coldness that makes him look strong and makes me look crazy. He told me that our baby together was covered, that that was the legal requirement, that the rest was my decision. I hung up with trembling hands and with a rage that wasn't just rage, it was panic, because at that moment I understood that he could leave me with the whole mess and continue to sleep peacefully. And I wasn't going to let him get away clean from a story he himself got into, because nobody forced him to play the perfect family. I looked at Kevin with his 10 years already forming a more conscious memory, and it broke my soul to think that he would be another child abandoned by a man. I was afraid he would blame me, because children sometimes blame the mother for everything, even if the mother is the one who stays. I needed Jorge to understand that you don't abandon a child just because there's no DNA. I needed him to feel that Kevin wasn't a number, but a life that he had shaped. And so this absurd war began, where I was the only one who seemed to be bleeding. In the end, what hurt me the most wasn't the money, it was the message. That idea that Jorge's love had clauses. I was trapped between survival and dignity, because asking him felt like begging, but not asking him was condemning Kevin to lose everything. And right there, at that crossroads where any option made me look like the bad guy, was when I decided that he couldn't continue acting as if this were just a separation of adults. I didn't accept him washing his hands of it, and that refusal was the first real break. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, so, you yourself say that Jorge paid for private school and even taught Kevin to ride a bike, and you still paint him as a monster because now he's complying with the legal requirements for his biological son. Sounds like you got used to the guy's salary and panicked about losing the lifestyle, not that you care about the child. Threatening to get depressed to manipulate him is textbook, as if your mental health were a lever to get money out of him. OP's response. I love how you always reduce everything to money because it makes you uncomfortable to admit that a man can be cruel with a smile. Jorge is not a hero for paying for a school he himself chose to pay for years. That's called emotional responsibility, not charity. And my depression is not manipulation. It's the natural consequence of being left alone with 2 children and expectations that he built. If it seems normal to you that a child cries because they were abandoned and the answer is it's not my blood, check your humanity. Anonymous User 2 says, you say combo, as if your son were a package included in a purchase, and on top of that you demand that your ex continue paying for a child that is not legally his because you can't afford the private school. The truth is, it sounds like your plan was to tie him down with a baby and have him continue to finance your life, but it backfired. And if your crises were so constant that he left, maybe the problem wasn't his coldness, it was you setting the house on fire and crying about the smoke. OP's response. Oh, please. The typical, you must be the crazy one comment, because it's more comfortable to blame the woman who stays to take care of things than the man who runs away from what he promised. The combo thing was a figure of speech, but if you want to pretend you don't understand to feel morally superior, go ahead. Jorge was not a victim of anything. He made decisions and now he's trying to erase them as if they were an uncomfortable chapter. And if I had crises, it was because carrying everything alone while he played the stable one breaks you from the inside. But of course, you don't see that because it's not measured in receipts. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since the last update and Jorge has remained exactly the same, as if my words were background noise. I was hoping, I admit, that the idea of me collapsing would trigger something, even if it was guilt, even if it was fear of looking bad, but he's not one to be moved by emotion. He's moved by control, by what he can justify to others. And when I understood that, I felt that if I wanted him to react, I had to touch the only thing that really matters to him, his image as a perfect father. Kevin was at that age where he understands too much, but still believes in people, and that's very dangerous because childish faith breaks and doesn't come back the same. He asked about Jorge with an insistence that cut my skin. He said he wanted to see him, why he didn't come anymore, if he had gotten angry with him. I tried to answer carefully, but inside my blood was boiling because I saw how Jorge was walking away without looking back, as if Kevin were a piece of furniture left in my house after the divorce. And in every one of Kevin's questions, I heard an accusation against me, as if I had to fix what a man had destroyed. I knew that if I continued to be gentle, Jorge would remain comfortable. So I had to make a decision that wasn't pretty, but it was necessary, because sometimes the truth is used as a tool. I told Kevin with a deliberately broken voice that Jorge didn't want him anymore because he wasn't his real son. I saw his face change, how his eyes filled with water, and yes, it hurt me, but I also felt that finally someone was going to feel what I felt every day, because I had had to carry that reality alone and I was tired of being the only one suffering from it. Kevin started crying in a way that isn't a tantrum cry, it's an abandonment cry, one of those that comes from the chest as if something is being torn out. I gave him the phone and told him to call Jorge, to ask him himself. Kevin dialed with trembling hands, and when Jorge answered, my son's broken voice came out, asking why he didn't want him anymore. I heard everything and felt a strange mixture, because a part of me wanted to hug Kevin and another part wanted Jorge to drown in that guilt. I needed him to hear the damage, not my version, but the living wound. Jorge didn't shout, he didn't get upset, he didn't break, and that was the most disturbing thing. He spoke to Kevin as if he were managing an office situation. He told him that he loved him, that he would always love him, but that things change when adults separate. I could almost see his saintly face as he said that, because he knows how to say the right phrases without feeling them. Kevin was crying and clenching his teeth, waiting for Jorge to say what I needed to hear, that he was going to take care of everything like before. But no, he chose the path that made him look good without giving me what I was asking for. A few days later, Jorge appeared with a solution that seemed like a lack of respect to me. He said he was willing to pay Kevin's school tuition directly to the institution, without the money going through my account. When he said it, I felt like he was spitting in my face because it was an elegant way of calling me opportunistic or irresponsible. It was control disguised as help. It was like saying, I'll pay, but I don't trust you. And I, who have maintained a house, 2 children, and an entire life on pure strength, was not going to accept being treated as if I were a thief. I was very offended, and it wasn't out of whim, it was a matter of principle. I'm the mother, I know what my son needs. I know what expenses there are. I know what the priorities are in a house. The school is not the only expense. There's also the rent, the food, the supplies, the clothes, the daily life that no one sees. And, besides, I had chosen the apartment where we live thinking about the salary Jorge had when he was with us, because he himself got us used to that level. It's not my fault that he now wants to cut reality as if it were a budget. When I yelled at him, he acted calm as always and told me it was the most responsible thing. That ignited me more because the word responsible in Jorge's mouth always means I decide. I told him that if he really wanted to help, he should give me the cash and that's it, because I'm not an intermediary, I'm Kevin's mother. He insisted no, that it was the only way. And there I saw it clearly. It wasn't help, it was a way of keeping me tied down without letting go of my neck. I rejected his direct offer to pressure him to give me the cash, because I thought that if he really wanted to look like the good guy he would give in. I thought he wouldn't be able to stand being pointed out as the man who leaves a child without school. I thought his pride as a good father was greater than his need for control. And for a couple of days I felt powerful, as if I had regained some ground, as if finally he had to react in my way. But the truth is that that move left me with a new tension, because if he didn't give in, I was exposed. Kevin looked at me with that face of a child who doesn't understand why adults play with his life, as if it were chess. I told him that everything was under control, that Mom was solving it, that Jorge was going to come to his senses. Inside, I was nervous, but I couldn't show it because if I fell, everything would fall. I kept telling myself that I was defending what was fair, that I couldn't accept crumbs with conditions, because if I accepted the direct payment, I would also be accepting Jorge's narrative, that he's the responsible one and I'm the unstable one. Jorge stood firm, and that surprised me because I had bet he would break. It started ringing in my head that maybe he already had a plan, that maybe he was collecting things to paint me as the villain. I got paranoid. Yes, because when a man gets too correct, it's because he's already setting the stage. I started recording every message, every word, every silence, thinking that at any moment he would use it against me, and that feeling of being in a Cold War kept me up at night. Meanwhile, school was still on, the dates were still moving forward, and I felt time like a countdown. Kevin tried to be strong, but you could tell because children feel fear, even if you hide it. I was trapped between my pride and the urgency, between not letting Jorge control me and not letting Kevin suffer. And that mixture is poisonous because it makes you make decisions with your gut, not your head. At the end of those 2 weeks, I was more tense than ever, with Jorge colder than ever, and with a horrible feeling that the next consequence was going to be worse than I imagined. Comments on the update. 1. Anonymous User 1 says, "How disgusting what you did. Literally, you told a 10-year-old boy that he's not wanted anymore because he's not a real son, just to use him as a weapon in a phone call. I mean, you describe it yourself, you put him on the phone crying to pressure Jorge, and then you get offended because the guy offered to pay the tuition directly to the school, which is the most logical thing if he doesn't trust you. You're not defending Kevin, you're defending your access to cash." OP's response. "Don't talk to me about disgusting. As if you've lived what it's like to see your son's face break with illusion every time he waits for someone who's not coming anymore. Kevin is not a weapon. Kevin is the victim, and people like Jorge hide behind calmness to pretend they're not doing any harm. I didn't make anything up. I said a truth that he's proving with actions. He's acting as if Kevin were disposable. And the direct payment thing is control because the school doesn't pay the rent, doesn't buy food, doesn't cover daily life. But, of course, you want me to starve while you applaud the nice gesture that looks good from the outside." Anonymous User I says, "Your principle is that they give you cash because you chose an apartment thinking about your ex's salary. You said that yourself. Basically, you're admitting that your priority is to maintain the standard of living, not the child's stability. And if you really cared about Kevin, you would accept Jorge paying directly and that's it, because that way the school is covered. But no, You prefer to risk his tuition to win an ego battle. OP's response. I'm fascinated by how you manipulate my words to make me look like a caricature, when the reality is that a house is supported with money and I don't have to pretend that the air is paid with love. I chose a decent place for my children because Jorge got us used to that, and because I wasn't going to raise Kevin in precariousness after years of stability. Accepting the direct payment would be accepting that I'm incapable of managing, and that label is exactly what he wants, so he can later say that I can't handle the children. If I give in on that, tomorrow he'll take away even my right to decide what they eat. But you don't see the pattern because you only look at the school receipt. Update 2. It's been a month since the last update, and time, instead of calming things down, has sharpened them like knives. I still had in my head the idea that Jorge was going to get tired of playing the blameless man and that out of pure social pressure or guilt he would end up giving me the cash. But no, my plan to refuse the direct payment was a miscalculation because I was fighting with emotions and Jorge was fighting with strategy. What I saw as a tug-of-war, he saw as an opportunity to push me against the wall without getting his hands dirty. And when I realized it, it was already too late. The school started calling me, not Jorge, not anyone else. Me, as if I were the only responsible adult in the universe. They spoke to me with that kind tone that is actually a threat, reminding me of dates, fees, commitments, and I felt my stomach tighten every time the phone rang. I explained to them that there was a situation, that the one who always paid was Jorge, that Kevin was there by mutual decision. They didn't want to hear stories, they wanted money, and I couldn't blame them, but I was indignant because in the end the system always ends up punishing the mother. They told me that if it wasn't regularized, Kevin couldn't continue, and that word expulsion stuck in me like a needle. I went to talk to Jorge trying to be civilized, because sometimes you think that with calmness men soften. I sent him long messages. I reminded him that Kevin was not a stranger, that Kevin called him dad, that he had to think about the damage. Jorge responded little, cold, as if he were making an executive summary of my pain. He told me that he had offered to pay the tuition directly and that I had rejected it. So the problem wasn't his lack of support, it was my irrational refusal. That phrase made me see red because he adjusted the narrative with a disgusting ease, as if I had chosen for my son to suffer for sport. And the worst part is that, seen from the outside, it sounded logical. Then I found out what he really did, and there I felt like I was running out of air. Jorge spoke to the school principal, not to me, not to the system, to the principal, like someone going to tell a polished version to look like the savior. He explained the situation with details, and in that explanation, he surely included my refusal of the direct payment, my crises, everything that suited him to paint me as a risk. Suddenly, it wasn't just a debt, it was a family situation that everyone at school knew about, and I felt shame, anger, exposure, because Jorge wasn't just resolving a payment, he was building a case file. Kevin started to notice the tension in a different way. It was no longer just asking about Jorge, it was feeling that something serious was coming. One day, he came home sad, saying that the teacher had mentioned administrative matters and that he heard his name in the office. I hugged him and lied with a smile. As mothers do when the world is falling apart, but the child has to sleep. Inside, I was in a panic attack, because school is a universe of glances and I wasn't going to let Kevin be pointed out as the problem child. And there the fear mixed with a rage that clouded my head. In that state, the idea began to form as a brilliant, almost poetic solution in my mind. If Jorge wanted to act as if Kevin was not his responsibility, then I was going to throw that responsibility back in his face physically, with no possibility of ignoring it. I thought that when he saw Kevin with suitcases at the door, with reality packed up, he would soften, he would feel guilty, he would realize that he couldn't abandon him like that. My logic was simple. A man can't resist seeing the concrete effect of his coldness, because coldness is better maintained when everything is abstract. I needed to make it concrete. It was a panic and rage attack. Yes, and also a way of saying, you're not going to leave me alone with this, because I was already tired of carrying the whole weight. I packed Kevin's things with trembling hands. I put in clothes, notebooks, his uniform, and everything I folded was like folding a piece of my pride. Kevin looked at me confused, asking what we were doing, and I told him we were going to talk to Jorge, that we were going to fix it. I didn't tell him the whole truth because children shouldn't carry the strategy of adults, but at the same time I needed him to be a witness that I was fighting. I needed him to see that I wasn't giving up. We arrived at Jorge's house and my heart was pounding against my chest as if it wanted to get out. I left Kevin at the door with his suitcases and started yelling from outside, saying that if he didn't pay, he should raise him. It wasn't a pretty scream, it was one of those screams that come out when you feel cornered. I thought Jorge was going to open the door, that he was going to be scandalized, that he was going to feel shame, that he was going to give in. I thought he was going to tell me I was exaggerating, yes, but that he was going to solve it so Kevin could come in, and this would calm down. I was betting on his humanity, even though he had already shown me that it didn't work. Jorge opened, saw Kevin, saw the suitcases, and, instead of reacting like a human being who has a history with that child, he reacted like a judge. He didn't yell back at me, he didn't beg me, he didn't get desperate, and that calmness was what destroyed me because it was the calmness of someone who has already won. He crouched down, spoke to Kevin with a soft voice, and I felt a deep rage because he could put on that voice, just not for me. He told him to wait, that he was going to make a call, and I thought he was going to call the school, that he was going to solve something. No, he called my parents. When I saw that Jorge was calling my parents, I was hit with such a strong wave of shame that for a second I was speechless. Because there is nothing worse than being exposed in front of your own family as if you were a bad mother. And that was exactly what he did. My parents arrived and saw the scene. Kevin with suitcases, me yelling. Jorge with a saintly face. My mother went after me with words, not with hands, but they still hurt. She called me a monster with an ease that still burns. I tried to explain that it was a desperate measure, that I just wanted Jorge to react, that Kevin couldn't lose his school, that I was on the edge. No one listened to my context, they only saw the headline. My father grabbed the suitcases, and my mother took Kevin's hand as if she were rescuing him from me. Kevin was crying, he didn't understand anything, and I wanted to die because I wasn't abandoning him for lack of love. I was pushing a reality for Jorge to assume. But of course, in a scene no one sees intention, they only see what happens. My parents took him away, and I was left outside with a mixture of anger and fear, because in a minute I lost control of the narrative. Jorge didn't just expose me, he disarmed me. After that, everything went downhill, as if the universe had aligned to punish me. Jorge began to move quickly, with that efficiency of a man who knows how to use the system to his advantage. I received notifications, legal messages, words like custody, stability, well-being, and I knew that those words were going to become weapons. Jorge took advantage of what happened to request full custody of our biological son, alleging mental instability on my part. I read that and my hands trembled because it was confirmation of what I had feared before. He didn't just want to stop paying for Kevin, he wanted to tear away my motherhood as punishment. I tried to react, I tried to talk to him, I tried to explain that the Kevin thing was an impulse, that I was desperate, that he knew my situation. Jorge didn't want to listen or pretended not to listen because he already had what he needed, a perfect scene to show me as dangerous. My parents, instead of supporting me, aligned with him because my mother preferred to believe that I was a villain rather than accept that a correct man could be cruel. Kevin stayed with my parents for a while and I was left feeling that I had lost my house, my older son, and now I was at risk of losing the baby too. And the worst part is that Jorge looked impeccable in all this, as if I had done everything alone. At the end of that month, I was trapped in a reality I didn't recognize, because the move I made to pressure Jorge became evidence against me. The school was no longer the only problem. Now it was a court, a case file, a custody battle where my emotions were going to be presented as an illness. I looked at my phone waiting for a message from Kevin and it didn't come. I looked at a picture of the baby and my face broke with fear. Jorge had achieved something brilliant and perverse, turning my desperation into his argument. And the immediate threat was clear. It was no longer just about losing a school, it was about losing my biological son completely. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, "This has gone from toxic to dangerous. You went to the guy's house and literally left a child with his suitcases yelling, "If you don't pay, raise him yourself." That's not a strategy, that's performative abandonment to manipulate. And then you act surprised because he called your parents. Of course, he was going to do that if he sees a child dumped on his doorstep. You exposed yourself. You gave him the perfect argument to ask for custody. OP's response. How easy it is to say, obviously, when it's not you who's watching your son's life fall apart and being left as a leftover. I didn't abandon Kevin. I took him to the only adult who for years acted as his father and who now wants to erase himself as if he were an administrative error. If Jorge had had a minimum of heart, he would have understood the message and would have solved the school issue at that instant, but he chose to call my parents to humiliate me, not to protect anyone. And yes, of course he did it, perfectly, because his specialty is to look like the hero while I carry all the hate. Anonymous user I says, you say you did it for Kevin, but it all sounds like you did it for yourself so you wouldn't lose the apartment, so you wouldn't lower your standard, so you wouldn't accept him paying directly. If you cared about Kevin, you would have accepted the school payment and that's it, without turning it into a bargaining chip. And the panic attack doesn't justify you dragging a child into a scene with your parents and your ex as a reality show. Jorge asked for custody because you gave him a real reason. You're unstable and children are not your therapy. OP's response. You use the word unstable as if it were a universal label to silence a woman who dares to demand what is fair. I didn't turn Kevin into a currency. Jorge turned him into a disposable when he decided he was only worth it if he carried his DNA. And the apartment thing isn't a whim, it's real life. My children eat, sleep, study, and that costs money. But of course, from the keyboard everything is solved with cheap morality. If I had accepted the direct payment, tomorrow Jorge would be telling a judge that he pays for everything and I contribute nothing, and then he would have taken the baby from me anyway. The difference is that I would have been left smiling while he dismantled me. Update 3. It's been 3 years since the last update, and it still seems unreal to say it out loud, as if naming it makes the loss official. In these 3 years, I didn't regain control of anything. On the contrary, everything closed around me like a slow trap. Jorge turned that scene at his door into the origin of a narrative that served to justify everything. And the cruelest part is that over time that narrative began to sound reasonable, even to people who knew me. I was left fighting with feelings and he fought with papers. The custody process was a machine that doesn't stop for tears or history. It feeds on evidence and appearance. Jorge arrived as the stable father, the man who deposits punctually, the one who speaks slowly, the one who never loses his composure. I arrived as the woman with anxiety, the one who despairs, the one who gets upset, the one who doesn't always sound elegant when she's being suffocated. It didn't matter how many times I repeated that I'm not a danger, that I'm a broken mother fighting not to lose her children. In those kinds of rooms, a broken woman is automatically suspicious. When they told me that Jorge won full custody of our biological son, I felt an emptiness that doesn't resemble normal pain. It wasn't just sadness, it was as if the body didn't know where to put the blood, as if they had moved my spine. The decision came with that phrase that nullifies you, visits under supervision, as if I were a threat. I came out with a stiff smile because you learn quickly that if you cry they write it down, if you scream they write it down. If you breathe strangely, they write it down. That day I understood that my emotionality, the same one Jorge said overwhelmed him, was now a legal argument. The first supervised visits were humiliating in an almost surgical way. I had to arrive on time, greet a stranger who took notes, and behave like a domesticated version of myself. My baby, who was no longer a baby, looked at me with that strange mixture of recognition and distance, because children adapt to the world they are put in front of. I wanted to hug him tightly, but I had to measure everything so they wouldn't interpret it as an outburst. Each meeting ended with the same taste. I came out with the feeling of having begged for minutes of motherhood. While I was fighting not to break in those visits, I was also trying not to lose Kevin completely. Kevin had stayed first with my parents, and that was already a wound, because they had torn him away from me with a moral judgment. I tried to call him, to bring him things, to ask for forgiveness without using the word forgiveness, because I didn't accept that I was the villain of the story. He answered me with monosyllables, with that adolescent coldness that is actually a defense. And I noticed that little by little Jorge was also getting in there, not for love, but for control. I had hope, even in the midst of everything, that, at least in Kevin's case, the effective memory would win. Kevin had grown up with Jorge as a father figure. He had learned to trust him, to see him as a structure. I kept telling myself that no one can turn that off so easily, that the real bond weighs more than war. But I underestimated how attractive the idea of security is for a child, and even more so for an adolescent when the world feels unstable. I also underestimated what Jorge is capable of offering when what he offers doesn't include me. When Kevin reached the stage of thinking about college, the economic reality became a gigantic shadow over our house. I did the math, cut things, stretched the money as if it were dough, and still I knew I couldn't compete with Jorge. And that's where the most ironic and painful part of all this comes in. Jorge did decide to help Kevin, but he did it like someone signing a sentence. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, it was a chess move with a smile. They told me as if it were good news, as if I should be grateful. Jorge created a trust to pay for Kevin's university and studies, and to anyone who hears it, it will sound like greatness. People love those gestures because they look clean, correct, almost noble, but that trust had conditions, and the condition was a single, clear one, designed to hurt me without having to touch me. Kevin could only access that support if he didn't live with me. In other words, Jorge wasn't helping Kevin to study, he was buying distance. When I heard that condition, I felt a mixture of indignation and vertigo because it was such a cold move that it almost seemed illegal, even though it was perfectly formal. I wanted to complain, I wanted to scream, I wanted to say that it was emotional manipulation. Confirms. But who do you say that to without them answering that you're crazy or that you're jealous? The system, the family, the friends, everyone sees money as salvation, and they don't see the invisible string that comes attached. I was running out of language to explain what was really happening. I spoke to Kevin. I tried to do it from a mother's place and not from the place of a wounded woman, although it was hard for me to separate it. I told him that that condition was unfair, that it wasn't love, that it was control, that help shouldn't come within either me or your mom. I reminded him of everything I did for him, everything I held up, everything I put up with so he could have stability. Kevin listened to me with a closed face, as if I were exaggerating, as if I were being dramatic. And that look scared me because it was the same look Jorge put on when he said I was too much. Kevin answered me in a way that still hurts me. He spoke of the future, of tranquility, of not having any more problems. He said that with me there was always tension, that there were always fights, that there was always something about to explode. He said that with Jorge everything was simpler, more orderly, more predictable. I was frozen because in his mouth simple meant without me. And there I understood that Jorge had been patiently building an idea for years, that peace is the absence of a mother. In the end, Kevin chose Jorge's money and stability, just like that, without poetry, without epic, like someone choosing a paved road instead of one with stones. And I can't pretend I don't understand it on a practical level, but on an emotional level it seems like a betrayal, because Kevin didn't just choose to study, he chose to leave my house as a condition to study. He accepted Jorge's rule, and with that he validated the narrative that I'm unmanageable. I felt like I was losing my older son for the second time, but this time with his consent. Kevin ended up living in an annex of Jorge's house, and that's a detail that haunts me because it sounds like a fairy tale to anyone but me. An annex, a space of his own, tranquility, food, stability, everything I couldn't give him at that moment. People tell me it's the best for him, and I bite my tongue because if I say what I think they call me selfish. But no one understands what it feels like to see your son move into the house of the man who dismantled your life. It's as if the universe is forcing you to applaud your own defeat. What destroys me the most is that Kevin calls him dad with a naturalness that used to be ours, and with me it has become ceremonial distant. He barely answers my messages, and when he does it seems like he's fulfilling a social obligation. At Christmas, he sends me short answers as if I were an intense aunt, not his mother. I try not to show the pain because I've already learned that if I break, they use it as evidence that I'm not well. But inside me, a mixture of jealousy, grief, and anger that has nowhere to go is eating me up. I ended up living in a rented room with my life reduced to the essentials, and that reduction feels like punishment because I didn't just lose comforts, I lost the place from where I exercised my role as a mother. Jorge fulfilled his promise to do the right thing, but he did it making sure I didn't see a single cent and, worse yet, that I had no influence. He took care of Kevin in his own way, yes, but he did it on the condition of setting me aside. And I was left at a point where I don't know what hurts more, having wanted him to pay to maintain the life we had, or having ended up without that life and without my children nearby. Sometimes I find myself reviewing every decision, looking for the exact moment when everything went wrong, as if I could undo it with memory. But the most brutal part of the story is that Jorge managed to install the idea that everything that happened was because of my instability, as if emotional abandonment didn't exist, as if control didn't exist, as if only my reaction existed. And meanwhile, I'm still going to supervised visits, trying to keep my biological son from forgetting me, looking at old photos of Kevin as if they were proof that I was once his home. The threat is no longer legal, now it's more silent. The possibility of becoming an uncomfortable memory to which one responds once a year out of politeness. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, 3 years later and you're still playing the victim as if you didn't start the fire yourself. You told a child he wasn't wanted for not being biological. You used him crying on the phone. You refused to have the tuition paid directly, and then you left him with suitcases at the door as a show. That's exactly what a judge needs to give you supervised visits. And Kevin choosing the trust is pure logic. He chose to study and be stable, not to stay in your chaos. OP's response. How convenient to call real desperation a show when it's not you who's watching your children's lives fall apart because of a man's cold decision. Jorge is not innocent. He's just better at disguising his cruelty with correct words and punctual deposits. You think stability is just silence and order, but you don't see the emotional cost of taking a mother out of the picture. And Kevin didn't just choose to study, he chose a condition designed to separate us. But of course, you love to applaud the one with power and blame the one who shouts. Anonymous User 2 says, the trust with a condition sounds like Jorge protected himself from you using the money, and with your history of I need the cash, because I manage it doesn't surprise me. Besides, if Kevin lives in an annex and calls Jorge dad, it's because Jorge was the one who remained a father figure even when you turned him into a villain. You wanted him to pay to maintain your standard of living. You said it, and in the end your own son understood that and left. It's not a conspiracy, it's a consequence. OP's response. No, it's not protecting himself, it's controlling. Because if it were really for Kevin, the condition would be about his performance or his well-being, not about with me, yes, or with me, no. I never asked for luxury's sake. I asked for continuity. I asked not to tear away from Kevin the world that Jorge himself helped build and then decided to dismantle out of pride. The fact that Kevin calls him dad doesn't erase that I'm his mother, nor does it erase that that distance was bought with a legal mechanism. And if for you consequence means that a mother ends up alone in a room while the others divide up her family as if it were spoils, then yes, what a correct world, the one you defend.